Look at the money in your wallet. To you, it represents hours of your life. Sweat, stress, sacrifice time with your family. You believe that if you work harder and save more, you will eventually find financial freedom. But what if I told you that the game is rigged from the start? What if your hard-earned savings are being drained by a force you cannot see, hear, or touch? There is an invisible thief in the room with you right now. It doesn't break windows, and it doesn't steal your car. It steals your future. Each year, the numbers in your bank account might stay the same, but the power they hold shrinks. This is the invisible tax. It is the silent, forced redistribution of wealth from those who work for money to those who have the power to print it. Think back to your parents or grandparents. In 1970, a single man's salary could buy a house, a car, and sustain a family of 5. Today, a young couple, both working 2 jobs, struggle to afford a basic apartment. Are we less productive than our ancestors? No, we are more productive than ever. The problem isn't your work ethic. The problem is the very definition of the money you earn. Behind the curtains of global finance, the anchor was cut, and the value of your life's work was set adrift. To understand how we became servants to this debt-driven machine, we must return to the exact moment the world changed forever. A quiet Sunday in 1971 that sealed the fate of your wealth. Welcome to Chronicles of Capital. This is not just history. This is how they steal your world. To understand the crisis we face today, we must look at a single humid Sunday evening in the summer of 1971. President Richard Nixon walked into the Oval Office prepared to deliver a television address that would change the trajectory of human history. To the millions of Americans watching at home, it sounded like a routine economic adjustment. But to the world's financial elite, it was a declaration of war on the old order. For decades, the world operated under the Bretton Woods system. It was simple. The dollar was backed by gold, and every other currency was backed by the dollar. It was an anchor of stability. If you had 35 US dollars, you could walk into the treasury and demand 1 ounce of pure gold. It was a promise signed in stone. But by the late 1960s, that stone was cracking. The United States was spending billions on the Vietnam War and massive social programs. To pay for it, they did what empires always do. They printed more money than they had gold to back it. The world noticed. France, under Charles de Gaulle, grew suspicious. They began sending warships filled with paper dollars back to New York, demanding their gold in return. The U.S. gold vaults were bleeding out. The choice was simple. Either stop spending or break the promise. Nixon chose to break the promise. In his speech, Nixon told the public he was temporarily suspending the convertibility of the dollar into gold. He claimed this move was to protect the dollar from international speculators. It was a masterclass in political theater. He used the word temporary, but that temporary measure is now over 50 years old. In that moment, the dollar became a fiat currency, money backed by nothing but a government's decree and its power to tax. The anchor was gone. For the first time in history, the entire world was operating on a system of unbacked paper. The constraints on the printing press vanished overnight. Politicians no longer had to balance budgets or worry about gold reserves. They could simply print their way out of any problem. But there is a law in physics that also applies to finance. You cannot create something from nothing without a cost. And that cost was about to be extracted from the savings of every man, woman, and child on the planet. As the 1970s progressed, the consequences became clear. Prices soared. The term inflation entered the daily vocabulary of the common person. But what most didn't realize was that prices weren't just going up. The value of their labor was going down. The currency was being diluted, like a glass of wine being filled with more and more water until the taste of the original grape is gone. This was the birth of the modern debt trap, a world where you have to run faster and faster just to stay in the same place. Where a house that cost $25,000 in 1971 would soon cost $500,000, not because the house got better, but because the money got worse. The Nixon shock wasn't just an economic policy, it was a psychological shift. It taught the world that promises are secondary to power and that wealth can be manufactured out of thin air, provided you own the press. Most people believe that for a dollar to exist, someone, somewhere, had to do a dollar's worth of work. They think that money is a fixed pie, and if they work hard enough, they can grab a larger slice. But in the post-1971 world, this is a fairy tale. The truth is far more unsettling. Money is not created by work. It is created by debt. Imagine a room with a printing press. When the government needs money, it doesn't have to fund a war, build a bridge, or bail out a bank. It doesn't wait for tax revenue to come in. Instead, it issues a piece of paper called a government bond. A bond is simply a glorified IOU, a promise to pay back the money with interest in the future. The government then hands this IOU to the central bank. Now, pay close attention to this next step, because this is where the magic and the theft happens. The central bank takes that promise, and with a few keystrokes on a computer, it creates money out of thin air to buy that bond. No gold was mined, no oil was pumped, no labor was performed. With a click of a mouse, billions of new dollars are flooded into the system. This is what economists call expanding the balance sheet, but for you, it should be called the Great Dilution. Think of it like a game of poker. Imagine you and your friends are playing with a fixed set of chips. You've played for hours, worked hard, and won a stack of chips. Suddenly, the house decides to introduce 10,000 new chips into the game and gives them to one player at the end of the table. What happens to the value of the chips in your hand? They haven't moved, but they now buy a much smaller percentage of the pot. You've been robbed without anyone ever touching your stack. This is exactly how the modern financial system operates. When the central bank prints new money, the people closest to the printing press, the big banks and the government, get to spend that money first before prices have had time to rise. By the time that money reaches you in the form of wages or a loan, prices have already spiked to reflect the new supply. This is known as the Cantillon effect. It is a silent transfer of purchasing power from the bottom of the pyramid to the very top. But it gets even deeper. In our current system, almost all money is debt. If everyone in the world paid off their debts tomorrow, there would not be a single dollar left in circulation. The system is designed to require more and more borrowing just to keep the currency alive. It is a giant global Ponzi scheme where the new debt pays for the old. And who pays the interest on all this debt? You do. You pay it through higher prices at the grocery store. You pay it through property taxes that never go down. You pay it by working 50 hours a week for a currency that loses value while you sleep. The system doesn't want you to understand this. They want you to focus on inflation, as if it's a natural weather pattern or an act of God. But inflation isn't a mystery. It is a policy. It is the steady, deliberate destruction of your savings to sustain a system built on empty promises. History does not repeat, but it rhymes. While we believe our digital financial system is a modern marvel, the truth is that we are simply walking the same path as the empires that crumbled long before us. The story of currency debasement is as old as civilization itself. To see our future, we must look at the Roman Empire. At the peak of its power, Rome's currency, the silver denarius, was nearly 100% pure silver. It was the bedrock of a world-spanning economy. But as the empire expanded, so did its expenses. Wars in distant lands, a massive bureaucracy, and a growing welfare state drained the treasury. The emperors faced the same choice Nixon faced in 1971, cut spending or find a way to manufacture wealth. They chose the latter. Emperor Nero was the first to realize that if he mixed the silver with cheaper copper, he could mint more coins with the same amount of precious metal. At first, no one noticed. The coins looked the same. But over the next 2 centuries, emperor after emperor continued the practice. By the time of the crisis of the 3rd century, the denarius, once pure silver, was little more than a bronze coin with a thin silver wash. The consequences were catastrophic. As the money lost its value, prices for wheat, oil, and clothing skyrocketed. Merchants refused to accept the worthless metal, and the once thriving trade routes of the Mediterranean began to freeze. The Roman government tried to fix prices by law, but you cannot legislate the value of a lie. The middle class was wiped out, and the empire, unable to pay its soldiers with real value, began to fracture from within. The Byzantine Empire, Rome's successor in the East, tried to learn from this mistake. For 800 years, their gold coin, the solidus, remained the most trusted currency in the world. It was the dollar of the Middle Ages. But eventually, the same temptation arrived. In the 11th century, the Byzantines began to shave the gold content of their coins to pay for their failing wars. The result was the same. The loss of trust led to the loss of power. What we see in 1971 is simply the digital version of this ancient crime. In Rome, they used copper to dilute silver. Today, we use computer entries to dilute the dollar. The method has changed, but the motive is identical: to steal purchasing power from the people to sustain a failing state. The survivors of these collapses weren't those who trusted the emperor's decree. They were those who understood that value cannot be created by a government stamp. While the masses watched their savings evaporate into dust, the few who held real assets, land, gold, and tangible goods, preserved their freedom. We are living through the same cycle. The only difference is the speed at which the ink dries. The most effective way to enslave a population is not through chains or cages, but through the destruction of their currency. When you destroy the value of money, you destroy the value of time. And when a man's time is no longer his own, he is no longer free. This is the ultimate psychological trap of the post-1971 world, modern slavery. In a healthy economy, your savings should represent a store of your past labor. You work today so that you can rest tomorrow. But inflation turns this logic upside down. It forces you to spend your life on a treadmill that never stops. Because the money you earn today will buy less tomorrow, you are never allowed to truly save. You are forced to take risks, to invest in markets you don't understand, and to borrow more than you can afford just to keep pace with the rising cost of existence. This is not a failure of the system. It is a feature. The debt-driven economy thrives on your insecurity. It needs you to be in debt because a man with a mortgage and a car loan is a man who cannot afford to say no. He is a man who will work 50 hours a week in a job he hates, paying taxes that fund a system designed to keep him in that very position. It is a closed loop of invisible bondage. Look at the statistics of the last 50 years. While productivity has soared due to technology, real wages for the average worker have remained stagnant. Where did that extra wealth go? It didn't vanish. It was siphoned upward. As the currency is diluted, those who own assets, the land, the factories, and the stocks, see their net worth skyrocket. Meanwhile, those who work for a wage see their purchasing power evaporate. The invisible tax is the primary driver of global inequality. It is a mechanism that punishes the saver and rewards the debtor. It creates a society where the young cannot afford homes and the old cannot afford to retire. It breaks the social contract that once promised that hard work equals prosperity. In this system, you don't get rich by producing value. You get rich by being close to the printing press, or by owning the assets that the printed money eventually buys. We are living in a house of cards, built on the stolen time of billions. The realization that the system is rigged is not meant to paralyze you. It is meant to wake you up. History shows that those who see the cracks in the foundation before the building collapses are the ones who survive. We are entering an era where financial literacy is no longer a luxury. It is a survival skill. You cannot stop the printing presses. You cannot change the decisions made in 1971, but you can change how you position yourself. The first step is to stop thinking in currency and start thinking in value. Understand that money in a bank is a liability, not an asset. Seek the things the system cannot print: real skills, real assets, and a deep understanding of history's patterns. The invisible tax only works in the dark. Once you understand the mechanism of your own entrapment, the thief loses his power over you. Every crisis in history has been a massive transfer of wealth from those who trusted the illusion to those who recognized the reality. The question is not whether the system will change, but which side of that transfer you will be on. We are at the end of a long cycle. The debt is unpayable, the trust is wavering, and the shadows of Rome are growing longer. But for the prepared, this is not just a tragedy, it is an opportunity. Wealth is never truly destroyed. It is simply moved. History has the answers you are looking for. I will show you where to look. If you want to understand the hidden forces that move the world, join us. Protect your time. Protect your future. Subscribe to Chronicles of Capital and become part of the few who see the truth behind the curtain. The archive is open.